Is higher education a good human capital investment? When people hear the word capital, they generally think of a bank account, a couple hundred shares of Microsoft, or an assembly line. These are tangible forms of capital, but are not the only form of capital. Schooling and education are also forms of capital because they have the potential to raise earnings. Therefore, economists refer to these expenditures as human capital because people cannot be separated from their knowledge, skills, and values in the way they can be separated from their financial physical assets. Today we will examine whether or not an investment in higher education is a good human capital investment. A decision to pursue higher education involves an informal analysis on part of the individual in educational pursuit to measure the cost of education against the expected value of returns to that education. Proponents of higher education as a good human capital investment turn to such statistics to show that earnings rise and unemployment declines for each level of higher education. These individuals suggest that the economic importance of education has been growing. Even as the number of college graduates in the labor force has increased, the wage gap between these workers and those with less education has widened. The increased wage reflects an increase in demand that has been greater than the increase in supply. This could be attributed to firms' investments in new technologies. These new technologies require more workers with the education and skills to use them. More and more of the nation's economic growth has been originating from sectors with high demand for skilled workers. The investment in new technology could reflect the firm's desire to take advantage of the increased supply of college educated workers. Or it could be the result of the development of new general purpose technologies, such as computers and telecommunications, that either require or are most productively used by educated workers. In either case, the increasing premium for college educated workers in the face of rising supply indicates that the growth in demand for college educated workers has exceeded that of the growth in supply. Opponents of higher education as a good human capital investment argue that somewhere along the way, a college diploma transitioned from a bargaining chip holding measurable monetary value to a relatively irrelevant piece of paper. Today, young adults pay thousands of dollars for education, only to walk off campus with expensive degrees, loan debt, and no jobs. Some say that the lack of jobs is a result of the fact that a third of college graduates coast through college without adding anything to their human capital. Several reports show that employers often find college graduates applying for jobs who are weak in basic skills to be numerous. It is also debatable that the educational value you receive in college can be easily acquired elsewhere. Essentially, you're paying people to teach you because theoretically they have the experience you don't, information you need, and the ability to impart all of this to you. Opponents of higher education as a good human capital investment argue that most instructors are incompetent grad students, uninterested professors, or ineffective communicators. Thus, educators are not providing any additional educational value that cannot be found in textbooks or simple online search. These individuals also argue that the required skills for 90% of careers are learned on the job. They say that if you're going into engineering, public accounting, or psychology, the major specific courses you will take are required training. You cannot start down these career paths without first acquiring a degree. But for most careers, however, job related skills are learned through entry level positions. This is why music majors make up the highest percentage of medical school applicants, and many biology majors end up in law firms. You learn what you need to learn on the job, rendering your degree useless on a practical level. Using the medical profession to illustrate a restricted entry of education as a prerequisite for a particular occupation, we can evaluate its production of private and social returns. To become a qualified MD, it is necessary to attend medical school. But since the 1930s, the American Medical Association has restricted medical school enrollments and has reduced the supply of medical doctors per patient. Suppose that in the absence of these restrictions, the supply curve of doctors would be at SS, while the demand curve would be at DD, with an equilibrium income of doctors at YO. Suppose that this earnings level were such that the rate of return was equal to that of other assets, and thus the supply curve was stable over time. By limiting college enrollment and the number of doctors to S1, the supply curve becomes SAS. And the income per doctor at Y1 shows that the rate of return on the cost involved of attending medical school above that of other assets, one would assume that more people would like to enter the medical profession. But the control over education keeps the supply at SAS. But because few professions have had this power to restrict the number of individuals obtaining the necessary education, this case, although used in other professions, is not particularly widespread. A more widespread case than that of doctors is that of education as a preliminary screening device in job searches. Individuals who possess different levels of different types of skills are more productive in some jobs than others. In a perfectly competitive market, each person would end up in the occupation in which their productivity was the highest. For such a market to function, it would be necessary for both the employer and employee to collectively decide the appropriate job slot. If the labor market functioned on this basis, the employer could allow the employee to take the job and pay them based on performance. The fact of the matter is, only a relatively small section of the labor market functions this way. Instead, because of the substantial costs associated with hiring and firing, people are generally paid by hour, week, month, or year, and are hired to lengthy periods of time. Even in the previously mentioned perfectly competitive market, the ability screening process could be flawed and expensive. As a result, the majority of firms use the notion that college graduates have a higher level of cognitive and affective skills. These firms decide to recruit solely from higher educational groups in an attempt to cut down on pre-screening costs. It is this use of higher education as a pre-screening method used by most firms to cut down on costs, and the absence of any other effective methods that I believe higher education is a good human capital investment. The rate of return on higher education exceeds that of other investments. The investment in a 4-year college yields a rate of return of 15.2% per year. That is more than double the amount of return over the last 60 years experienced in the stock market, and more than 5 times the return on investments of corporate bonds, gold, long-term government bonds, or housing. Beyond that of personal return, studies have shown that investments in human capital are essential for sustaining economic growth over time. The law of diminishing returns suggests that investments in physical capital and land eventually fail to result in economic growth. Yet countries such as the United States have sustained economic growth over the past century. Heavy investment in a better educated labor force are given credit for much of the growth in per capita income and economic productivity. Despite the perceived return on investment in higher education, the current student debt in the United States is $1.4 trillion, with an average graduate owing $33,000. In addition to the previously mentioned oppositions of higher education as a good human capital investment, student loans are a large contributing factor to these opposing views. Men and women laboring under student loan debt are postponing marriage, childbearing, and home purchases. And it's evidently limiting the percentage of young people starting businesses and ultimately contributing to the further innovations and increased production. This is because typical student loans are unsustainable and penalize students too much. A possible solution to this problem would be the implementation of income contingent loans. Income contingent loans are available in countries like Australia. They require payments based on income until the loan is repaid. Payments are sensitive to the student's ability to pay through an adjustable repayment period. The return for the investor is fixed, but it can fall below the initial value if income is not enough to repay the loan during a long period of time. Another approach might involve human capital contracts. This is where payments depend on income until the repayment period ends. They are contracts to finance education through which investors finance students' expenses in exchange for a percentage of the student's future earnings. So, in conclusion, we began by looking at capital and the different types of capital. First, we looked at tangible capital, then, we looked at human capital. The underlying difference is that people cannot be separated from their human capital in the way that they can be separated from their tangible capital. We then began to look at proponents of higher education as a good human capital investment. These individuals argue that earnings rise and unemployment declines for each level of higher education. They also argue that the wage gap between educated and non-educated individuals has begun to widen. We then began to look at opponents of higher education as a good human capital investment. These individuals argue that college graduates essentially coast through college without adding anything to their human capital. They also argue that the education that can be obtained in college could actually be acquired elsewhere from textbooks or simple online search. These individuals also argue that the required skills for 90% of jobs are actually learned on the job. We then looked at education as a prerequisite. We first saw the restricted enrollment in the medical profession. We then saw that education was used as a pre-screening process for firms to cut down on costs of hiring and firing individuals. I then stated my belief that higher education was a good human capital investment. I believe so because of the pre-screening process that was previously mentioned, as well as the absence of any other effective methods. We then began to pinpoint a problem. We decided that the problem was individuals being handcuffed by loan debt upon graduation. $1.4 trillion in the US is attributed to loan debt, and each individual graduates with approximately $33,000 in debt. This creates a significant economic effect as these individuals postpone essential economic productivity that has an effect on the overall economy. I then proposed the solution. The first was the implementation of loans based on income until that loan was repaid. The second was contracts to finance student expenses in exchange for a percentage of the student's future earnings. Thank you for viewing my presentation. I really enjoyed the learning process associated with such unique projects such as this.